I propose to pass to our next guest. The still will be online, as you know. And in fact, she's the second speaker from Great Britain today.
I am here.
Oh, great, Hilary.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. And so let me introduce Hilary Orange. We are very happy she's between us, also behind a wall of a screen. I suppose she's somewhere in England, maybe she will say where. And Hilary Orange, she's a senior lecturer at the history department of Swansea University. And she also formed in archaeology, as we've seen the other professor from England this morning, but she was for a long time, she researched for a long time in Germany, and where she concentrated a lot her attention about the industrial archaeology, its representation in the dark, if I can say that, and so I only read the title of your lecture and let you the space, and then I will come back for some question, hoping that next time our public will be so excited to say something. Okay, so please welcome Hilary Orange, that she will present excuse me. And the next lecture, the title of which is Using Artificial Light to Shape Industrial Landscape, a Nocturnal View of the Ruhrgebiet.
So many thanks to Roberto and the rest of the organisers of this conference. And I can only imagine some of the stress you must have been under this week when we heard in Britain that the government in Switzerland was going to put all UK arrivals into, I think it was 10 days of quarantine. So I am sorry not to be with you in person, but I'm so pleased that this is still going ahead and that I can still talk to you today. And where I'm located, I'm actually not far from London. I'm about 35 minutes by train from the city. So I'm going to be talking today not about internal light, but about external light. I'm going to be talking about the way that artificial light has been used to shape landscape and influence structural change in the Ruhr region of West Germany. Structural change is the term that's used in Germany, where we would use the term in deindustrialization. So it denotes a more managed concept of economic and cultural transition following deindustrialization. And the use of artificial light, particularly through a 10-year project that you may already be familiar with, I imagine as architects, the International Bauausstellung Emsha Park project. I'm just going to call it EBA for short. And I'm going to be talking predominantly about EBA today. And that project not only kick-started structural change in Ruhr, but introduced this kind of regional phenomenon of light art being applied to former industrial sites. And that tradition, it's actually a tradition that I want to present to you, because although it was positioned as a future-making tool to evoke the idea of a new Ruhr, it's actually part of a cultural practice that extends back in time to certainly until the early years of the 20th century. And so I've got 5 sections to present to you today. I'm going to talk about how I fell into light or night studies. I'm going to be talking about Eva Emsha Park. I'm going to talk about light art after Eva. I'm then going to go back in time to talk about some of the ways that of precedents to Eva Emsha Park and the ways that artists and photographers were already involved in looking at industrial light and thinking about industrial landscape. And then I'm going to summarize with a very brief conclusion. So light studies, or conversely night studies, because in my mind, the two go together very closely. So my background is in archaeology. I started off digging up Roman villas in England, very bucolic settings. And I migrated into looking at industrial landscape, and hence I wear two hats. One hat is as an industrial archaeologist, and the other hat now is predominantly in terms of my interest in industrial heritage and landscape. I first became involved in doing archaeology or doing archaeological forms of field work at night when I was in Japan. I went to Japan in 2013 and 14 to look at the trend of kojo moe. Kojo moe translates into English as factory love. Now, this is a popular form of photography in Japanese cities predominantly, where Tokyo dwellers go to industrial locations at night and they take photographs of work in industry. And this is an example actually from Osaka. And this has actually become a burgeoning kind of domestic tourism. So you can actually join bus and boat tours that take you out to these sites so people can take photographs. And you need to book up for these tours about 3 to 4 months in advance. They're that popular. And so it was when I was out on a boat in Tokyo Bay in March, freezing cold, fingers so cold I couldn't even take photographs, that I realized for the first time I was doing a form of archaeological field work at night. And I began to think about that and to think back on my career as an archaeologist, somebody who's worked in the field in excavation survey, and to wonder why I'd never considered that before, and why my idea of archaeology and field work was so connected with daylight and daylight practice. As already has been said today in the first talk, if I'm going to mispronounce your name, I'm so sorry. Ifonzi, I'm going to give up at that point, and my apologies. The preferred view of archaeology is in daylight hours, and so this is just a screen grab from Google. I just typed in archaeological reconstructions, and this is what comes up. And so the clearest and preferred view when you're doing archaeological fieldwork, if you're doing excavation, it is either in daylight or it's under artificial light conditions, so you can actually see what you're doing. But the problem with this is that it in turn influences the kinds of interpretations and narratives that are made. And I have published an essay where I looked at post-medieval contemporary archaeology, surveyed some journals, and I found there that there were discussions of tavern culture, tavern artifacts and archaeology, where the night was only really briefly considered. So I do think there is this bias in archaeology that is slowly being addressed. Now, the claim that the humanities, including archaeology, is day-centric is not a new one. And I've just included some quotes here of people who've talked about this previously. So nighttime has remained the forgotten half of the human experience. That was Roger Eckerk. Tim Edens, the geographer, has said that academic writing is largely focused upon the cityscape by day. And after returning from Japan and getting involved in light studies and night studies reading, there were various arguments as to what accounted for day-centrism in the humanities. So Gallen and Gibson, in an actual book on archaeology of the night, said that there's a general light blindness. There's also the idea that we're immersed in artificial light, immersed in a way that we don't actually see the light and we don't see the light fit in. So I'm sitting in a room right now with electric light over me, but to look at that electric light would actually be painful on my eyes. There's also the working culture. So when I've worked in commercial archaeology, you tend to start the day at anywhere between 7:30 and 9, you're out in the field. You try to finish by about 4 or 5, depending on the season. And there's also the idea that daylight is linked to an objective and scientific gaze and a clarity of thought. So we can talk about muddy thinking, if you like, or I've got a foggy brain today. These are all the kind of atmospheric and aerial metaphors that we tend to use around opaque or clear ideas of thought. And I just want to flag up some of the books that I particularly read and enjoyed. And from the 1980s, there's been this growing interest in light within the humanities and also within urban planning and studies of science and technology. I've mainly concentrated on histories of light, and these tend to convey a progressive narrative. They talk about light becoming cheaper and brighter and cleaner over time. I particularly enjoyed Jane Brox's book, Brilliant, which is the one on the far, well, on my far right of the screen. I'm not sure on what side it is where you're looking. And in that book, Jane illustrates the various light technologies that have existed over time. And she talks about redundancy. So some lighting might seem redundant, but then you can question, well, is it? So one good example of that is people having paraffin candles in their homes, in their electric powered homes. And some of these histories focus on the impact of electric light in particular on society and its association with modernity. So electric light, since its inception, has enabled movement and transportation, safety and security, comfort and domestic utility. And electric light has also colonized language, as this quote from Prose says, you know, we have bright ideas and we have light bulb moments. The anthropologists Mikkel Billet and Tim Floor Sorensen have argued that light is both material and a social practice. And that's something that particularly kind of connects with my archaeological practice and archaeological gaze in terms of thinking about material, but also thinking about the way that material influences society and vice versa. And so you can look at light and you can look at its thinginess, you can look at its tactility, as in a light fitting, an electric light bulb, or you can look at its infrastructure across landscape. But you can also look at the way that artificial light influences the way that people move in a landscape and how that in turn influences materiality. So road systems are one obvious example, street lighting is another. And artificial light is commonly discussed in positive terms, but it also has negative associations, of course. So, for example, in control and surveillance. But there are many advocates for darkness, for night, and for shadow, and for gloom. So the geographer Tim Edinson has argued that positive dimensions of darkness and gloom have been overlooked, but can be reclaimed as an intrinsic part of the urban environments. Now, personally, I enjoy being out in the dark, and I've never been afraid of the night from childhood, but I'm going to come back to that point a bit later. And now I'm going to turn to looking at Eva Emsha Park and the 2-year research project that I conducted in West Germany in the Ruhr region. So to briefly introduce that project, I was funded by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and what I was doing was, this is after I was in Japan, I went to Germany to look at the way that artificial light was being used in relation to industrial heritage in these former variously coal steel sites, some iron working sites as well. So the Ruhr deindustrialized from the 1950s and 60s after the coal and steel crises. And I was interested in the links between the artificial light and light art as applied to former industrial sites and regional culture, because I'd never seen such a concentration of light art and illumination being used on industrial sites as I had in the Ruhr when I'd visited. And I explored light designs and concepts and strategies. And I also was interested in the people who were visiting these sites at night and why they were there and what they were doing. I was also interested in exploring my own experience of conducting nocturnal field work, what that felt like. And my parameters were, I was only looking at external lighting. And although I was predominantly interested in artificial light, I also was interested in managed firelight. And my methods were mainly, site surveys. As an archaeologist, I actually want to go out and look at the sites. Ethnographic, I did interviews with people ranging from light designers to electricians. I made observations, field notes at night, and I immersed myself in various archives and photographic archives. So I was fortunate enough to be able to access the Eva Emsha Park archive. And I had a look at, say, the archive of the Krupp Foundation, as in Krupp, the founder of the Krupp dynasty, the steel magnates. Okay. This is an image of, obviously, planet Earth at night, and it's NASA's black marble. And what I found interesting working in the Ruhr and working at night in the Ruhr was I became much more attuned to the seasons. I became fascinated by things like sunset hours. I had apps on my phone that told me exactly when it was going to get dark that night. And I made many German friends. And I realized that I was living in a slightly paradoxical environment, because West Germany is relatively dark if you compare it to, say, Delhi in terms of sunshine duration in hours. However, I never experienced true darkness or true night in the Ruhr. It was too brightly lit. There was too much light pollution. So although I was exploring these sites at night, they were never actually environmentally that dark. There was always some kind of background lighting that affected my experience, but also, you know, my photographs and my ability to understand how people were actually connecting with these sites. So in terms of methods and field work, I admit initially I was slightly nervous. I was there on my own. I'm a woman. I was sometimes going out at 8 o'clock at night, sometimes not back till 2 o'clock in the morning. And the summer was particularly difficult, and winter came with huge relief. So this is a tradition I started of photographing bus and tram stops, the last bus or the last tram home. And I became obsessed with reading timetables to make sure that I didn't actually miss my bus and tram home. But this shows some of the varying light conditions between, say, 7:40 at night and 10 o'clock. And again, I'd never really been aware of the seasonal shifts until I started to do this kind of work. To talk a bit about the Ruhr, you probably know where it is, but here's a map. So the Ruhr is shaped by near contiguous urban developments, and it's also shaped by 4 rivers. So the river systems are the Rhine to the west, the Ruhr to the south, down here, and the Lippe to the north. And then a 4th river, which is canalized, runs through what was the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. It was the most heavily industrialized and also heavily polluted part of the Ruhr. And this was the part that actually names the Eva Emsha Park project. This is where the park or the project area was situated. And so you have this line of industrial cities such as Essen and also Bottrop, Gelsenkirchen and Oberhausen that were part of Eva project zone. And so the Ruhr is now home to some 5 million people, and it's now re-greened. But as I said, because of the steel and coal crises from the 50s and 60s, there was this phase of deindustrialization that's still continuing, and also concerted efforts towards economic, environmental and cultural renewal. And yet the industrial past has been very closely held within that process of structural change. And although there's new industries and environmental policies and new forms of cultural capital, you cannot live within the Ruhr without being aware of its former industrial past. I was like a cat in catnip I absolutely adored living there because everywhere I went, I was seeing signs of past industry. And so to talk a bit about Internationale Bauerstelle and Emsha Park, so it ran for 10 years from 89 to 99. One of the things that was interesting about the project was that it was a decentralized urban development program. And so there was two kind of things that were happening. There were either competitions where there were calls for architects and light designers or whoever to make proposals, but they also invited proposals from city authorities, and those city authorities also worked with local citizen groups. And altogether, 117 projects were actualized through Eva Emsha Park. And the whole point was to basically kickstart structural change and to create a new Ruhr and to solve interrelated economic, social, and ecological problems, focusing on that landscape area surrounded the Emsha River. There's been loads written about Eva Emsha Park, so I'm not going to go into the actual project in that much detail because I don't have time, but these were the guiding principles. So one, looking at rejuvenating the polluted Emsha River and also joining up green spaces, connecting green corridors and revitalizing green space, creation of new housing stock and also new employment opportunities, for example, through new science and technology parks. And then the industrial heritage and the light design comes into the last bullet point, which was really dealt with more in the second phase of the project from 94/5 onwards, and that focused on art, culture and tourism, including the development of leisure and adventure space. I don't know why I put that map in, so I'm just going to skip over it quickly. So, okay, the director of Eva Emsha Park, Professor Karl Ganser, wrote in 1993 about a dark and stormy night he spent on a mine heap that was just north of the city of Emsha, and you can't see it, but just beyond the mine heap is the Emsha River. Now, this appeared to be in the archive the first reference to a lighting concept for the park, because Eva went on to consider the Emsha zone not just in the day but also at night. And through studying the archive, it became clear that the origins of this idea very firmly sat with Karl Ganser, and in particular his experience of being climbing these mine heaps at night to look out on the metropolis, on the urban landscape. So this is Schurenbachhauder, and what was erected on Schurenbachhauder in 1998 was a piece of art. It's a steel slab by the American artist Richard Serra, and it's actually it's unlit. There's absolutely no lighting up there at all. So if you do go up at night, you're going to be, in relative darkness, if you can be in relative darkness in the Ruhr, because again, it's so brightly lit. He writes about this idea of using the mine heaps to shape and give a spatial identity to the park, and to create a system of space where landmarks can be utilized as vantage points, but also as orientation points in the landscape, where one can perceive the external limitation as well as the visibility of the landmarks in the interior. At this stage in 1993, he's thinking about temporary lighting. He's thinking about things like fireworks, or he also talks about Christmas trees at one point. He talks about there being fireworks in the sky, which at the same time can be a symbol of the process of Eva Emsha Park and a system of decentral varied project ideas. He conceptualizes kind of balls of light sparking off in the night sky. And he believes that the lighting of these landmarks particularly interested in mine heaps, but also industrial objects, would be a means of making the regionality of Eva more visible at night than by the day. And here's a sketch. So this is from the archive. So the slab is actually shown right at the center. And this is actually titled in English 7 Ups, although the rest of the writing is in German. And what you have around Schurenbach-Haude and the slab of the Ruhr is you have these other industrial objects, including mine heaps. But here is the gasometer at Oberhausen, a gigantic, basically, gas tank. And there are other sites as well. So this is Zeckezollverein, the World Heritage Site in Essen. And he sees Schurenbach-Haude and this mine heap and the slab of the Ruhr as being like the compass point at the center of Eva Emsha Park. So I just thought this was pretty cool to put in. And I'm going to talk about a few of these sites. I don't have time to talk about all of them, there's too many. But I'm going to talk about the tetraeder, the pyramid at Bottrop, which is actually shown in this one here, the triangle. This is probably one of my favorite places in the Ruhr. If anybody ever wants to visit, I would thoroughly recommend taking a train out to Bottrop and a 20-minute walk up to this site. It's a 90-meter steel and concrete sculpture, and it actually is it comes in 2 parts. You have the architecture of the pyramid, but then there's a light art that was designed by J.L.I.T. Fischer. The structure was designed by the German architect Wolfgang Christ. So this was actually proposed by the city of Bottrop along with RVR, which is the regional it's a regional association, and also RAG is the German coal mining company. And it's a spectacular site. And one of the things that you can do there, as you can see in the slide, is you can climb it. And this is quite common with a lot of these industrial features in the Ruhr, that there's a certain freedom to actually get inside them and to climb up them. Excuse me, I'm just going to cough. And climbing is interesting because to get to the tetraheder, you obviously have to climb up the mine heap, and it's steep. So there's 2 routes. You can either take a slowly winding serpentine route, or you can take the direct route. And it's quite a climb, let's say. So you need to be fairly fit, and you certainly need to be fairly able to actually get on top of some of these mine heaps. So I wanted to put this in to just show you a view of the urban Ruhr in the daylight. Another place where you can climb up industrial objects, in this case furnaces, is in Duisburg. Lanches Park, Duisburg Nord. It's now an industrial park. It was the Thyssen Ironworks at one point, and then when they closed down, the site was left abandoned for several years. The city didn't really know what to do with it until Eva came along. And it was landscaped by, let me just make my site, by Peter Latz. But the light design is by the British light designer Jonathan Park. And it's an enormous area that's accessible at any time of the day or the night. You don't have to pay to go in it. And as I said, you can actually climb up inside the furnaces, and there are gangways and walkways over the structures. The lighting by Jonathan Park was originally conceived as being temporary lighting. The idea was that there was going to be a concept there, and Jonathan Park comes from a theatre and concert lighting background. And so the design evolved from that original concept and has now become permanent. Here's an impression of the site by day, so you can get some sense of the surrounding landscape. And so much of this, as I said, you can actually climb up. You can go up about as high as this. And there's an image of Jonathan Park in his London studio. He sadly died a couple of years ago, but he was a delightful person to actually talk to. And one of the points he made when I was interviewing him was that he was very keen that the park would be accessible to the former families of the iron and steel workers, because when these sites were actually operational, they were like forbidden cities. The lights could be seen at night, and people often had childhood stories of looking at the industrial lights of these steel and ironworks, but they never necessarily went inside the factory or the plant walls because they weren't workers. And so one of the ideas about Emsha Park was actually to make these places accessible. One of the things that lighting does, of course, is it creates atmosphere, and it creates a welcome, and it creates waymarking, and it gives people a sense of security, a sense that they actually will be enabling them to visit at night and not just by the day. And that feeds into the nighttime economy. So at Duisburg Lanches Park Nord, they have events throughout the year. And those events are both daytime events and also nighttime events. And that's one of the ways that they're actually making money to keep on managing the park.
I don't want to catch you, but I think we are in later because we start in later, 15 minutes later, so that's why. Huh?
So 10 minutes more?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll skip through this then. So what happened after Eva, and this next section is short, don't worry, is that the successive places like Duisburg, Lanches Park led to a certain amount of rivalry. The cities outside Emsha Park wanted their own light designs, and this is one example. It's in the city on the Ruhr River. It's another ironworks called Hattingham. And here the curators of this industrial museum got together with some lights at night and literally just strung them up. And what also happens on these sites is that you get these torchlit tours. So that's another way that light is actually introduced to these sites at night through torches, through tour guides and tourists going around with torches. And why this is important is this is a quote from the curator at Hattingham. Is he says, "We have visitors who say, I remember this enormous light when the blast furnaces were working. Then the scenery became dark. We can't recreate that, but through the lighting, we can become part of the community again. The people have changed, but we have to be prominent in the city's silhouette. So we need this lighting as well." So the way of relighting these industrial sites that went dark after they closed was a way to actually make these dark spaces in cities light again, and to say that the Ruhr was open and open for business. Okay, next section. And now I'm just going to briefly go back in time, because there are historical connections here. And the ones I want to talk about are the ones that link to fine art and photography, although there are some others. So there's an old nickname for the Ruhr, an old moniker. The Ruhr used to be called the land of 1,000 fires, and that links to the industry's association with steel. And the earliest published example I found for this was in a 1924 collection of poems and short stories, where these were, if you like, very romantic images of the Ruhr region, and the concept of seeing these blazing fires at night from these steelworks, and how that connected to senses of home, but also homecoming. And there's been this fascination with the working lights of industry, going way back in time, and professional photographers were out in the landscape photographing these sites from the 1910s and 1920s. And these examples are not unique. There's hundreds of them. So that says to me there's always been this kind of fascination throughout the 20th century with this industrial sublime and this idea of industry at night through industrial lighting. And so I studied these night photographs, and I realized that in a lot of them, it wasn't necessarily clear at what time of day or night the photographs were taken because of the amount of air pollution. So in the photograph on the left, you have, this is a factory in Duisburg, where workers are covering over their cars in the day because of the amount of smog and air pollution. And in the photograph on the right from the 1960s, you can see what air pollution looks like. And so the Ruhr, the air over the Ruhr is being cleaned up now, but in several of these photographs, it could be dusk or it could even be twilight. So it's not necessarily clear what time of the day the photographs have been taken. And then there are links to fine art traditions as well, which I'll go through quickly. So there were a couple of interesting precedents that almost prophesied Eva Emsha Park. So in 1952, the German sculptor Werner Graf called for an artistic redesign of the Ruhr. And then later on in 1968, the playwright Ferdinand Krivitz wrote a manifesto for the restructuring of the Ruhr through art, where he urged artists to embrace the largest artificial landscape in Europe. And this is an example of a light installation from the 1980s from a land exhibition called B1, and B1 is a road system that runs through the Ruhr. So there were earlier light designs to Eva Emsha Park. That's the only point I want to make. And then there were other later ones. So this is Otto Piani from the Zero Art Group. And so the Zero Art Group based in Dusseldorf also talked about doing work in the Ruhr, and they never actually actualized any of their plans. But ultimately in 1999, this is another light art piece that went up in the Ruhr. And it's obviously shaped as a miner's lamp. And again, it's on a mine heap. So what was the reception to all of this? I've nearly finished, by the way. I'm nearly done. Generally, very little criticism. Most people like this light art, and they like the sites. The opening of the tetrahedra, the pyramid, was accompanied by a protest by the Green Party over the visible sign of money and energy waste. Urban planners have talked about the eccentricity of Eba's decentralization, and that it led to this kind of organic form of light art that hasn't been necessarily planned. And then mainly from historians that I've met in the Ruhr, their main concern is about the aestheticization and the way that light art hides the social histories and the dark histories and the labour histories of these sites. So this point has been made by Kirsten Barnt, where she talks about these loose and imaginative futures that hide the tensions and the past realities of the hard work and labour conditions, and indeed slave labour in some cases, of working at these industrial sites. And you could add to that, obviously, the ongoing issue around industrialization and climate change. You know, what does this industrial lighting actually say about that? Well, nothing to very little indeed. And one of the interesting things I want to say is that what Eva didn't see, and there's no reference to it in their archive, is digital photography, because it didn't exist then. And with the advent of digital photography, there's been this explosion of night photography on the sites. And these are very typical images of the way that the Ruhr is now represented and marketed. And so to conclude, I'll just pick out a few main points so I can finish. Eva was central to the development of industrial lighting, its industrial heritage sites in the region. These lighthouse projects have spread to sites outside the Eva Emsha Park. And the act of relighting these darkened sites is symbolic. It links to the history of the Ruhr, and particularly the steel industry. And they've become a magnet for night photographers. And so, although the light designs were originally conceived of as being experienced through the body, through climbing, through seeing these sites, they're now consumed and circulated a lot through digital media, and I think that's an important point to make. The way that we actually connect with these sites has now changed. So I just have some acknowledgements to show up, and I just want to say thank you. I'll be welcome to take any questions. And I'm writing a book on all this, by the way, so that should be published hopefully next year. If you want to know more about it, then obviously wait for the publication to come out. Okay, thank you. Back to you, Roberto.
Congratulations and thanks for your brilliant lecture, and brilliant in the sense that you give some light to our perspective and this seminar. As usual, I ask first of all for a question in the auditorium. I let you think. Meantime, maybe I start with something. And one point maybe it was more about the beginning of your presentation, because you introduced very deeply the question of the relation with industrial lights. And I think that we also have to consider now the fact that maybe we can talk more about a nocturnal environment. Once more, also, if we think that the inside of the buildings were not only concerned by the lighting, but the problem to have some form of light that can allow to do things. But this was also related to other aspects, like, for example, the light that was produced in the kitchen, doing preparing foods, the eating. All that's really created through the persistence of particles or in the inside the atmosphere that create what Rainer Barner, for example, called the environment before the invention of electric light. There was quite something dense and foggy and more complex in presence of materials of a simple relation with a light in a bulb as we have in our time. So I don't know, you talk a lot about the industrial, but I think there's something to see also about that, about the natural atmosphere, if I can say.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I think it goes together, the natural environments, you know, and the industrial. They coexist completely. So I guess that's what I found quite interesting, becoming more attuned to light conditions and seasons, thinking more deeply about the environmental conditions that surround these sites. And there's some interesting work being done around aerial geographers. I can't remember the name of the author, but talking about fog. And I think we, you know, in talking about light and darkness, I know Tim Edensor has made this point, you know, talking about gloom, and there are other kinds of conditions of light that we exist in. And so what I found on these sites where the photographers appeared at twilight, they were there for what's called the blaue Stunde, the blue hour, because that's when they could get the best photographs. And then they disappeared as soon as it was completely dark or almost dark.
Oh, thank you. Very question from auditorium, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your very beautiful exploration of a region that is one of my favorite regions of Germany. So I'm happy you also spent a lot of time there. I have a question about this point of the industrial sublime and this idea of the lack of consideration of the sort of very harsh social regions of the social reality of this region, as well as you very well mentioned, this idea of maintaining these sites lit up at night really transform the way this whole region thinks of itself and represents itself, also with the advent of social media and so on. But isn't this idea of the industrial sublime also a way for the region itself to not wake up from this sort of trance where they keep being stuck in this sort of industrial nostalgia of a period that is long gone, that was actually horrible in many, many ways, both for the health of all the people that worked in these industries, but also because currently there's also a lot of post-industrial reality that they have to be dealing with. No? So the social reality of the fact that the Ruhr region is one of the poorest regions in Germany because there are no jobs, derived from the fact that the whole mining industry, the coal industry and so on left this region. And I was just wondering if you could share some thoughts about those two things. I mean, I believe that perhaps there is no answer, but perhaps there are some strands of research, like you pointed out, that Ms. Band also is doing, that should sort of push for a more, an awakening of this trance in which we ourselves may fall into the danger of continuing to replicate and propagate this idea of the industrial sublime.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really big question, important point. So thinking about those toxic legacies and those toxic pasts, and certainly I have many colleagues who are doing work in that area, including some that are looking at industrial landscape. And I guess I'm conflicted because, you know, I have to say I immensely enjoy being out on these industrial sites and meeting with former workers. And I meet with former miners who they have a kind of a reflective nostalgia. They have nostalgia for their past work and for their comradeship, you know, the experience of actually working on these sites. And I think that Germany has actually managed deindustrialization far better than our successive governments have ever managed it in the UK. So some of the people I talked to, they you know, were pensioned off with pretty healthy pensions. But you're right, the Ruhr is a predominantly poor region. And so there is a definite tension and conflict there. And I don't have any easy answers. It's balanced, I guess, by a lot of the history from below movement that arose in Essen in the 1980s and oral history. And these sites aren't devoid of other forms of narrative and interpretation. So at Duisburg Landscape Park, there are interpretation boards and there are tours that you can go on and there's books that you can buy. And so it's difficult. I wonder whether people will access these sites if they're new to them, and then they will go away and perhaps they will find out about those histories and learn a bit more deeply. I hope that I get the point about the playfulness, because going back to Eva, these industrial objects in the landscape were basically seen as a form of creative resource. And I know people who have serious problems with that for the reasons that you explained so eloquently. So the way I see it is that these sites are, on the one hand, contributing to nighttime economy. And there is still work on these sites. The electricians and the people who work in the cafes and the site managers, it's still work, but it's not visible work in the way of workers pouring through factory gates. So there's that. And then there's how can we create other narratives to balance the aestheticization. Yeah, it's a huge issue, and I just don't have any ready answers. But I think you've actually expressed it really eloquently.
Well, thank you for tackling it. It's not, I know it's not a question and answer type of question, but thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.
No, well, thank you for your question. It's a really good question.